Welcome everyone to our October State Conference Rewind webinar. Today we have Decoding the Cloud, Valuing Data Centers with Ellen Berkshire and Jennifer Wadland. During the presentation, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I think there might be different points in the presentation too that our presenters may unmute for more conversation or ask you to put things in the chat as well in response to questions that they have. We also will have time after the presentation for questions too. So we want this to be interactive. We want you to be able to ask whatever questions you have and get what you want out of this webinar. So please don't be shy. Our presenters today, Ellen Berkshire, founding partner at Verros Berkshire, has practiced property tax law since 2003. She represents commercial, industrial, and complex property owners in Illinois and Michigan, from small businesses to power plants. Ellen has extensive experience with assessment appeals for major retailers, exemptions for schools and religious organizations, and securing tax incentives. She appears before local boards, tribunals, and courts and teaches real estate law for the IPAI. Jennifer Wadland, partner at Verros Berkshire, focuses on commercial, industrial, and residential tax assessment appeals, property tax incentives, and real estate transactions. She previously served as in-house counsel for a national shopping center owner, managing $98 million in retail dispositions and handling development, leasing, and corporate matters. Her experience spans industrial, multifamily, and commercial properties. A DePaul Law graduate and Callie Award recipient, Jennifer began at Verros Berkshire as a law clerk and returned to the firm in 2020. Everyone, please welcome our presenters.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. I know I saw some familiar names and I see some familiar faces joining us today. We're here to decode the cloud on some level, at least, and talk about valuing data centers and some of the complexities that surround this particular asset type. Joining me, as was stated, is Jennifer Wadland. It might have said Peter Verros on the original sign-in, but Jennifer was actually the one that helped come up with these slides. And between the three of us, we've talked ad nauseum about how to value data centers and still don't have all the answers, but we're here today to at least talk about some of the directions and analogies in the tax world that we can look at to help guide our valuation strategies.
Yeah, it's been a fun in-house pet project almost.
We're almost sick of data centers, but okay, let's see if I can figure out how to do this. Why is it not? Okay.
So there are several components to the data center. Some of them are relevant for today and some of them aren't, but let's start with what's there. So there's the real property, the concept that we all understand. We've got land and a building. That's what we're in the business of valuing and assessing, right? And then coming with that to take this into something more and make it specific for the use. There are a number of super adequacies, machinery, equipment, and other personal property that are integrated into this property to get it suited for its use as a data center. Also coming into this are a number of business property considerations and also intangibles. This is ultimately a business of storing and utilizing data more than anything else. So the real estate is just housing that larger business concept. In line with that, you'll see a number of contractual agreements. We won't call them leases because data center operators don't call them leases. They call them agreements or licenses. They don't call the occupants of their space their tenants. They call them their customers or their clients. So we're going to use the same terminology that those data center operators use.
Okay. So when we think about all the data center components, we always have to take a step back and think about it in the context of where we're coming from. And we're in the land of Lincoln. Here we have a modern day Abe Lincoln in his little hoodie who's ready to talk about data centers with us. In the land of Lincoln, there are several very important considerations. The first is that we are a state that is value in exchange, not value in use. So we're not looking at the business use occurring inside of the property. We're looking at the bricks and the mortar and what that property would sell for. That is value in exchange. The next one is that in Illinois and in most states, ad valorem taxation doesn't include the going concern. That is taxed elsewhere. So when you think of a hotel or a franchise operation or something that includes business value and the going concern, that we have to take out. Also in our state, we value the fee simple.
Don't worry, I will say a plug. The leased fee interest, the income from that lease is also taxed elsewhere. It's just not meant to be taxed here in the property tax world. Your income is still taxed. So lease income is taxed.
Yeah. And you guys are really lucky today because we added this slide so that we could show you a modern name, but also I wanted to talk about something that I had been reading about yesterday in relation to a different property asset and valuation strategy, and that was the integrated industrial plant doctrine. And Illinois, most of Illinois, I think we have someone from Grundy County joining us today. Grundy County has essentially adopted the integrated industrial plant doctrine, but most of the rest of Illinois has not adopted the doctrine. And basically, the integrated industrial plant doctrine is, in its simplest terms, a doctrine that says that if that we don't tax, because we don't tax personal property in Illinois, anything that is not integrated into the plant, the machinery and equipment that could be removable for a different user or a different use is not to be taxed. So I think that comes into play in the data centers. We're not 100% sure exactly how that plays out yet. Because these are new asset types, we don't know what machinery and equipment might stay for the long term or what might have to be swapped out depending on how the business changes and how the operations and the market react. So that doctrine, I think, is going to be something we need to like flesh out and talk about further as we talk about how to properly value data centers. And that ties into that last bullet point, which is just the fact that Illinois has abolished most personal property taxation, which would include machinery and equipment.
So with that context in mind, let's talk about data centers more generally. There's a few different types here. I think in Illinois, you're often going to see the colo or co-location types and the hyperscale. The colo are kind of like multiple clients in the same building. And then the hyperscale are your big boys, the tech giants are creating those hyperscale or xScale data centers. And then there's other types in between that kind of span that gap.
The modular, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and when we've presented this before with Peter, when I presented with Peter, we've gone into a little bit more detail on these next few slides, but we're going to kind of breeze through them because it can get a little bit meaty and it's not necessarily all that important, but important for context of understanding what a data center does. So the first thing is redundancy. All data centers developers are driven by the need for redundancy. This is a system critical consideration. What we mean by redundancy is effectively if you're a data center client that has banking information, or you're doing what do they do now? You can gamble online, right? Like you can't have that stop, right? You can't have the gamblers not be able to make their bets immediately. That's what redundancy effectively is. It's having the backup so that there's no failure or breakdown in the ability for the folks that are using the data or the widgets or whatever you want to call them in the data center, and that ability to access that information is not disrupted. So there's a base level N, there's the N+1, which is extra capacity, the 2N, and the 2N+1. And basically, as you go down this list, it becomes more secure and less fault tolerant.
I think the other piece to remember here is all of this is in the tech, it's part of the business operation of a data center. And this is ultimately something that's changing. As technology moves on, we find better processes to produce redundancy. So none of this is stagnant, it's all a moving target. And similar then with the different data center tiers. So currently there are 4 tiers. There's rumors now of a 5th tier, just getting more and more fault tolerant as the structural components move on. Ultimately, it's just how much uptime is there in a year? What amount of downtime can be tolerated in a given annual period? Again, this is a moving target, right? All of this technology is changing and growing with us. This is a hyper fast moving product type And it's not that the real estate is changing, it's still the same brick and mortar, still the same land. It's just the technology and property innovations happening.
And also the business needs. So you may have a higher need for business data integrity if you're housing a bank client, or you may have, um, just saw something I wanted to say. No, I lost it, but that's okay.
Was it up here? Sorry.
Yeah. It's okay. It wasn't that important. I lost my space. But basically, it's all related to the business driving what tier you need to comply with. It's the clients and the customers that are demanding these types of requirements. It's not coming from the developer.
I think you could almost look at some parts of this as like branding in a retail space, right? Like this is driven by the customer here. We're branding on, say, like a Ross Dress for Less is going to be driven by the tenant. Some of these tier necessities are driven by the customers. So very, very useful.
Or they could be driven by the government because of government requirements about redundancy, fault tolerance, and other factors.
We'll talk more about government
We
input
sure
here
will.
later on. Oof.
Yeah, this slide's rough. This is data center operation designations. And again, this is just setting the top context for folks that are here joining us to understand all these different complexities and layers that are occurring in data center operations. This last layer is just a designation that is, again, usually demanded by the client or the customer that is using the data center. So there's special European standards. There are special standards for telecommunications operators. There's special standards for banking, data protection, risk management, that kind of thing. So it all depends effectively on the user and the business use. That's all we're going to say about that one.
Moving on.
Now we can talk about some of the fun stuff.
All right. So the viability of a data center development, really, there's a lot of financial components and intangibles that come along with this type of development, which I think to some extent happens with any type of development, right? So here you're just seeing some of those intangibles on a higher scale. So our financial concerns and then also government concerns are going on here. So we touched there about regulations. One of the big things here is BIPA, which what is
It's Biometric Information Protection Act.
And
this has been around in Illinois for some time, and it basically protects us from going into a business and having our fingerprints scanned or our faces scanned and then transmitted and used elsewhere, or even not even transmitted and used. You can be in violation of BIPA just for taking that information without authorization. This has become a super big concern very recently for data centers. There was a recent article, I think it was in Cranes, talking about how some of the developers who were literally in the process of breaking ground to develop data centers in Illinois were not able to secure some of the agreements with their customers that they thought they'd be able to secure because the customers have suddenly been looking at some of these BIPA concerns. And they're like, well, until we figure that out, we're gonna go to a different state, or we're not gonna sign this agreement at this time.
Yeah, BIPA puts some of the data integrity liability on the customer, not necessarily on the data center operator, which the data center operator had a lot of that liability in the past. Now it's putting it on the customer, and so customers are hesitant to sign agreements with data centers located in Illinois.
Right. And then we've also got, I mean, obviously data centers has been in the news. It's been being talked about everywhere. Everybody's talking about AI and all these other explosive things that are happening in the world, and it's very exciting and also very scary. So some of the governmental concerns can also bleed into public concerns, the NIMBY concerns, the concerns about water, the concerns about environmental issues,
energy costs,
noise, you name it, they're coming out of the woodwork to talk about it. That's not really our lane, so we're staying out of it a little bit, but just putting it on this slide, which to talk about sort of the last three things on the slide, the financial, government, and public, and understand that these are major concerns of a data center owner operator and particularly developer. So now we'll go back to land and technology considerations. I'll let you go with land.
Sure. So ultimately, land is land. And now we can concede here a bit that land that is prime for data center use might have higher value than other, maybe industrial or commercial land in a particular jurisdiction. That land is going to have proximity to utilities, it's going to have access to high volumes of electricity. You're going to have favorable public policies in this area. There are certain, I think, was it Aurora recently said no, no data centers right now. Pause, no data centers. So land outside of Aurora might be more valuable to data centers right now. They're also looking for locations that are disaster resistant. You don't want something that's going to be in a floodplain, or maybe near a hurricane risk, an earthquake risk. The physical property needs to be able to withstand what comes at it. So we're not looking at high risk areas there. And then also there are some specific user needs. A customer might need to be near their end client. Um, just for purposes of speed. So there are certain areas that we're seeing more data centers going and some areas where we're maybe seeing less. And ultimately the land value underlying those in those hot data center areas might be going up even for other property considerations as well.
Yeah, and just a final note sort of on the land valuation issue, especially for the assessors that may be on this call. Even if we're going to concede that land that meets all of these particular requirements may have a higher value if it is being acquired and then ultimately used for development of data centers, you still have the problem of equity. So you can't go into an area per se and be like, well, this meets all the great requirements that would be necessary for land for data center development until it sort of occurs,
There
right?
has to be an active data center market,
Yeah.
right?
And well, the other problem you can run into is where you may have an area that was previously more of an industrial park, and then you've got some guy that's still trying to operate his mom and pop industrial building, and you're going to jack up his land as if it is data center land, but it's not. It's sort of like when you see a neighborhood that is undergoing a change and you've got all these McMansions around, and then the little old lady is sitting there in her
bungalow.
one-story bungalow, and you can't punish her because everything around her has changed. So there's other concerns on the assessment equity side of the coin that need to be considered, even if we do concede that land for data centers might have somewhat more value.
Yeah, it's a tough balance, right?
Mhm.
We each have our role in that, and that balance is a difficult part of it. Next.
Okay, technology risks. Oh, where do we start? So obviously there's a lot of risk in the technology that goes in data centers because it is a new asset type and it's evolving at a high speed in almost every facet, from cooling to racking to servers. You name it, it's changing extremely rapidly. It's extremely expensive. It's volatile and subject to immediate depreciation, including functional obsolescence and external obsolescence. And then, of course, we have the potential personal property tax implications with respect to certain technology. And I'm going to go ahead and throw this analogy in here, even though I said I would talk about it, because I feel like it fits here. And that is that if you're looking at something like auto manufacturing, like a stamping plant, those stamping plants have to have presses to press the specific type of automobile that is manufactured in that car. That machinery and equipment to press those particular cars is extremely expensive. It is physically attached and big and heavy and difficult to move. But by gosh, if no one wants to buy that particular type of car anymore, if the market no longer demands it, the business use requires them to swap out all that machinery and equipment and swap it back in. And as far as I know, in most parts of Illinois right now, that type of machinery equipment is not taxed as real property. It's personal property. And that ties into what we talked about previously with the integrated uh, industrial integrated plant doctrine. And I think there are some definite analogies here with the M&E and the volatility and the fact that yes, it looks like big machinery and equipment, and yes, it's very expensive, But if the business needs change, if the technology changes, you bet they will swap that out on a dime and they will replace it with what they need to put in there.
Yeah, I think there's also something to note that we can take that example and apply it directly to data centers. We've seen where we need 100 racks in one data center. And now, because technology has changed, you can have the same computing power with 5 racks. So now we have all of this surplus space, and you can't add more racks there because we've already maxed out the energy use of that particular building. So there's already ways that this is changing, and we're finding obsolescence that I don't know was expected. It's coming out in different areas. So it's an evolving concept, and one that we're going to need to keep our eyes on and see how maybe energy needs adjust, see how other technology changes. Maybe data centers are a temporary property type for all we know.
Yeah.
Things could continue to change. I mean, imagine the room that a computer used to be in when computers were originally made, and now we can hold one just like this.
Yeah.
So
one right here.
right. So data centers could change just the same way over time. I think we need to be prepared for massive volatility.
I think Abe Lincoln would say, the future's so bright, you got to wear shades. You don't know exactly what's going to happen, so we have to be very careful and cautious about how to value these. Another example I wanted to give on the changes that are happening so fast is the enterprise storage arrays, which cost $100 to $1 million. That's the storage array systems. The prices have dropped rapidly, and those models, even the ones that cost up to $1 million, have become obsolete in 3 to 5 years. So that's just another example of how speedy things are changing here.
Ultimately, it's good news for us that we don't value the personal property. We don't have to keep up with all of that. We're telling you what's there. We're helping try to delineate some of where that line might be between personal and real property. And some of these things are complicated and they can be somebody else's problem, right?
Yeah. Okay, so now let's talk about a little bit about valuation. So we've sort of covered the landscape for what a data center is and how they operate. And now we are going to talk about some of these components. So we've discussed business value, real versus personal property. We will now, when we go through each of the approaches to value, we'll talk a little bit about what income is attributable to the real estate and some of the confidentiality.
So I will say the confidentiality, I'll take a pause on that, is something that you're going to see be an issue throughout the approaches to value. And I think there's different layers of confidentiality to be aware of here. We're used to seeing a confidentiality clause in, say, a lease. And having written some of these leases, I can tell you that one retailer doesn't want the retailer next door to know all of the little things that they put in their lease. So they're going to make that confidential. Similarly, the landlord doesn't want each tenant to know what they've given the other tenants. They want it to be private. And that consideration is present in data center agreements. But I think it even goes a step further. And more importantly, is the fact that the data centers they're ultimately holding our data, and they don't have a business if they can't prove to us, the end consumer, that they're protecting our data. So I've seen these confidentiality clauses in data center agreements be incredibly strict. They don't even allow you to say who the customer is in that particular location. These big tech giants don't want you to know where it is because they don't want someone that would harm you or your data to know where it is. So there are safety concerns wrapped into these confidentiality agreements. To be fair, we have seen very little even from our data center clients. They're not allowed to give it to us. There's very specific times that they are allowed to share agreement information, and even ad valorem property tax appeals is not one of them.
And then if you take it another level, the confidentiality, it might not just be for the end user. It might be a confidentiality requirement coming from the government side. Or the banking side, or there's like multiple different layers and angles of that confidentiality.
Yeah, it's above and beyond what we would normally see in a confidentiality concern.
We've never seen clauses like this. Okay, so now we will apply the models. Why is it important to talk about the different valuation models when it comes to the data centers? Well, we want to try to provide some sort of uniformity, certainty, and accuracy. I mean, it would be great if we had some direction telling us what the best model would be to value these property types, but right now, we have not been given any direction other than the fact that Illinois seems to really want data centers to enter into our markets. There's a clear governmental push from Pritzker's office and other places in trying to get data centers to come to Illinois. At one point in time, I think we were top three in
We're
data
st-
center development.
We're still a major market. We're not the
We've
top
fallen
market
off a bit.
in the US. But there are still some major data center markets in Illinois. I think it's also fair to say we all have concerns about data centers and about the fast-moving technology that there exists anyway. It's going to continue to grow, whether it's in Illinois or not. So there are tax dollars to be gleaned from it. There are benefits to having the data center be local. So it's not all evil. I understand why we push back, but ultimately we just need to figure out how we're going to value them. And if we provide fair and predictable treatment to this property type, Illinois on the whole is going to benefit. It's going to benefit taxing bodies and it's going to benefit potential data center owner operators.
Absolutely. So I don't know if Anne, if you want to open it up so that if somebody wants to talk during this section, that is fine with us. If you want to unmute people, because now
Give them the option.
oops. Now we're going to go through each approach to value. What did I do? Okay. So the first one is the comparable sales approach.
Let's start off with the strengths here. We know that this approach to value is preferred by PTAB and the courts. We've seen that time and time again.
Oh my gosh, what are we doing there? Can you?
Yeah.
Doesn't like me. The sales comparison approach obviously reflects real world transactions, another pro, and it allows benchmarking against similar properties, but we'll get on a con on that as well.
Yeah, so let's talk about where we're going to run into trouble in this particular approach. First of all, there are limited sales. There's a limited number, honestly, of data centers in the country. It's still not a heavily prevalent property type. So we're just not going to see the sales volume that we would for other industrial properties.
Yeah, there's approximately 5,000 data centers total in the US, in comparison to 1.4 million industrial properties. So the sheer lack of a large quantity of these types of assets leads to the fact that there are fewer sales.
And then when we get into the nitty-gritty of those sales, you will find it difficult to extract the business value that's tied into that sale. They're messy, these sales are. Once you start talking with sale participants or looking into the sale documents, they get really messy really fast. And I think that's ultimately what we're seeing as a problem here. These are custom properties. So even when they are in a similar property class, they're all data centers. Each data center is very different, built with specific users in mind and customer needs in the back of their mind. There's these agreements tied to them.
Right.
It gets messy.
Yeah, and that ties back to all the tiers and the redundancy requirements and ultimately what the use is of the property, not the value in exchange of the data center, but the use. And when you start talking about those extreme feature variations, you're going to have to extract those because they relate to the use of the property itself.
Yeah, so then we're used to seeing what a sale looks like when it's impacted by agreements on the property. It's the similar here. Here we're just running into the additional obstacle of it being wildly confidential and it's not even a true lease. So it just gets difficult.
And some of them are built to suit as well. That's the BTS acronym there. And both the PTAB and the Illinois courts have routinely thrown out build to suit sales and even leases that were clearly negotiated under a build to suit agreement between a developer and an operator.
I think we're also seeing a lot of change in this market. It's a volatile market. I think it's also important here to note that there are a limited pool of market participants here.
5 or 6.
So it's really hard to get a temperature for how the market is reacting to the real estate itself when you have so many business concerns and a limited pool of market participants. It's a tough approach to value. Oh my goodness. So let's talk about income.
All right. This is a useful approach, obviously, when sales are limited or the sales aren't clean or the sales have issues with removal of business value. The other pro to the income approach, that's probably the biggest pro of the income approach, is that you can adjust the cap rate. You can adjust the cap rate for risk and depreciation, and then just argue about what that risk and depreciation is and how that affects the cap rate. And it also accounts for operating expenses and market conditions. So again, the difficulty is getting that information.
Right. Yeah, it's all locked down, which I think is one of our first weaknesses here. You're not going to have access to a lot of this data, unfortunately. The lease rates, not even lease rates, but the expense that the customer is paying to occupy space here is tied not just to real estate. This isn't like a normal retail or industrial lease. This is something different. They're really buying an opportunity. They're buying access to a utility.
Yeah. Or they might also be paying more because of the redundancy or the fault tolerance or the proximity to a particular user. There's all kinds of other things that go into it that are related to business considerations of the clients and the client's clients. So pulling that out becomes difficult.
And then there's also different levels here. Some colo locations, you're going to see a lot of personal property and business services included in the offerings of that agreement. If you're talking about a hyperscale, you might see that pared back, and the customer might be interested in the shell building, the powered shell there, and not as interested. They'll come in and provide their own services. They'll provide their own personal property, machinery, and equipment. So it's really, there's a lot of difference going on the spectrum here in these agreements.
And even in the hyperscale, I would say that in some instances, that machinery and equipment isn't owned by the owner of the real estate. So it's similar to when, like, I'm going to turn it back to the auto manufacturing, but 30, 40 years ago, auto manufacturers didn't always buy the machinery and equipment that was in their facilities. It was leased. And because it could be removed if they were going to do a different type of carts. I feel like that's kind of similar to the hyperscale.
I think it is. Although if you can get your hands on hyperscale terms, I think those are probably more accurate for our purposes, because then you're really looking at the powered shell. That's
the good thing about
isolating real estate. Yeah.
And this approach.
So as Ellen talked about before, we've got this build to suit issue is also at play here. I walked through one data center where it was a colo, but one user had taken additional rentable area, for lack of a better term, to create a hallway connecting two different components of their space there. So it's not easily then reconfigured for another user. When two units, for lack of a better word, are connected, then it's built to suit.
We've mentioned this multiple times, but we'll reiterate it one last time here. In order to do a proper income approach, you really have to have accurate income and expense data. That's not only for the subject property, but obviously for the market. You need to make sure that the subject property's income and expense data is in line with the market. So you don't only have the problem of getting the income and expense information from the particular owner or operator that you're trying to value the property for, but the market in general.
And then we talked about the cap rate as a pro. It can also be a con. There's a lot of variability in this market, volatility in this market, and that's hard to measure, even with an expert interpreting the data that is available. And then I think we talked about that income and expense. I think it's important to remember that even if you were to see an income and expense statement, it's kind of like a senior living facility or a hotel where there's a lot of business value still wrapped into those income and expense statements. It's not like an apartment building where you're going to see more clean real estate value reflected there.
Yep. So that leads us to the final approach to value, and that is the cost approach. And we're going to go through the pros and cons. The first pro is in the cost approach, you can actually capture and distinguish certain specialized features that are features that are part of the real estate. So that might mean the cooling or the raised floors or something like that that
Mhm.
could be viable for another user. And you can cost out that. Marshall Valuation Swift has a data center section in their manual. Um,
I will say on cooling, there's already changes happening.
yeah,
And
that's
I've seen a number of systems that are now outdated, and few year old systems that are now outdated and no longer the industry preferred.
yeah. When we spoke about this last time, I think two or three people in the audience had information about new cooling
Mhm.
systems. So it's, again, the volatility, the rapid depreciation, and the fast changes that are occurring with this type of asset.
Here, though, we aren't quite as concerned with the business value. We need to be careful about what's personal property and what's real property, but ultimately, we can leave the business value out of it and have a cleaner valuation when we're looking at just the cost approach.
This is really a big pro. As for uniformity in Illinois and equity, this can be applied uniformly by all jurisdictions. Again, there might be exceptions in certain counties that have adopted different procedures and rules about how to value personal property in or machinery and equipment in their particular jurisdiction. But overall, the cost approach can be applied uniformly.
Yeah, I think that's beneficial to all sides of this. Everyone wants predictability, right? And if we can agree on how best to approach it, and maybe a cost approach is a great option there. There's locational adjustments in Marshall valuation, so we can provide that uniformity and that predictability that serves the taxing bodies and serves the property owners. And then over time, we're going to learn more about how this property class is depreciating and what that means for the real estate. So we don't have that information yet, but we're going to continue to grow the pool of data that we can rely on in that aspect. Now, unfortunately, we don't have all the information quite yet. We're getting there though. The depreciation is still a tough thing to measure.
And I mean, I know I've seen reports on large industrial buildings, and people yell and scream that my appraiser's doing terrible things because they've got 80, 90% depreciation. But in the case of assets that are literally going on the market, and by the time they're up and running, they're already creating the newest and greatest thing, that it's a lot of depreciation is already there. It's like driving your car off the lot, right?
Yeah.
It's immediately depreciated. The other con is that cost manuals will need to be updated regularly for the asset class. Not really our problem, but
Yeah, but
getting access to that information is difficult.
as the technology continues to change rapidly, this our access to data is going to have to change along with it. We're going to have to be ready for those consistent changes.
So those are the three approaches to value, and we're then like, okay, well, where does that get us? We got some pros and cons. We've obviously got pros and cons. But so we wanted to look out to case law and statutes to see, well, is there something that we can analogize to? And that first bullet point, I've already pretty much brought that up multiple times already in this presentation, and that is the comparison to auto manufacturing. And you could also compare to large industrial plants that have a lot of M&E. You know, we are not meant to be taxing the widgets that are built in an industrial plant with certain machinery and equipment. Just, it's, I think, hard for people to get their head around the fact that this data center is kind of just a glorified industrial warehouse that's producing things, but they're not tangible. It's not a specific widget. It's your actual data. It's actually more important than a widget. It's, what we're all becoming is these bits and bytes saved everywhere. So
I'm reading a book that described each of us as having our own voodoo doll hidden essentially in a data center. And as we move through the digital world, our voodoo doll starts to look more and more like ourselves. So we want to, I don't know that any of us really want that to exist, but it does. And we want to make sure that it doesn't get in the wrong hands, right?
yeah. The next analogy that we were making is commercial energy storage systems. This was a bill valuing about how to value commercial energy storage systems using a cost basis. And that did not pass, but it's expected to pass. But I wanted to include it to see, okay, well, this is something similar. It's new technology. It's something that didn't exist before. It's something that's prevalent and not going away anytime soon. We're getting guidance from our legislature that cost is the way to go with that. So I see similarities with data center, and it makes me lean a little bit more towards the cost approach. Same thing with the wind farms.
And then I think we see super adequacies in other property types as well, and maybe we can look to see how those things are handled with those property types.
Yeah, and then I thought we would find guidance in cannabis cultivation facilities. I did not. I did not find any actual cases or statutes that would provide any guidance on that. So it appears everybody's just getting along on those, how to value those.
I know.
But they do have similar super adequacies. They've got special energy needs. They've got special lighting needs. They've got special watering needs and HVAC and cooling. So I think I'll continue to keep my eyes open for any litigation or legislation related to those types of facilities to see if there's any sort of guidance that we can get on that level.
So let's zoom into one analogy a little bit more. So we know that hotels are another property type that have a lot of business and intangible value, maybe personal property tied into it. So let's see how those percentages break down if we're talking about the cost of a hotel versus the cost of a data center. So if we look at land alone, on a hotel, you're expected to be 20-ish%, 10 to 20% of your overall cost is going to be the land. For a data center, that's much lower at 6%. Then your hotel building is 55 to 70% of your end cost. Data center, we're at 21%. So land and building, we're under 30% for a data center. Soft costs on a hotel, 10 to 15, and then personal property is that last 7 to 15. You're going to see the overwhelming majority of the cost of a data center being wrapped up in that IT equipment. So that's 73%. So just another thing to keep in mind. We're used to seeing some properties that have some business component, and we're used to what is a normal amount that comes off for business value. I think we need to kind of reframe that in terms of data centers. There's much more of an upfront investment for those non-taxable assets in a data center.
Yeah. And that IT equipment cost arguably includes both personal and potentially some real property, but it's also going to be wound up with the price that the customer is paying to use that facility, depending on what the IT equipment is. So they're bound together.
Yeah, and any of those considerations aren't decided by data center operators due to the real estate market. All of that is in reference to the market of their particular customers. They're not looking at the real estate market. They're not concerned with the real estate market. They're concerned with their data market. And I think we need to remember that the players in these markets aren't concerned about what we as the property tax people are worried about. Those aren't their motivations. They're not worried about the real estate market. They're worried about their data market. And that's what's driving their decisions.
And that just harkens back to what we originally said, that Illinois is value in use. Value in exchange, not value in use. So as a value in exchange state, and most states are, but there are some that are not, we are not concerned with the business use and valuing that. That's taxed elsewhere. We take care of that outside of the ad valorem assessment process.
Yeah, and it's tough to value something when the owners and operators of this asset class isn't concerned with the real estate value, and that's what we're entirely concerned with. So it's tough to try to glean from the information they have what we need to know when they're not even bothered by it. They're focused on something.
They're engineering over there.
Yeah, their brains are somewhere else.
So that leads us to our conclusion slide, which we hope that we've given you some guidance here, but we do not claim to have all of the answers by any means, because data centers are an untested asset class. They've got these unique considerations. They're particularly sensitive to market conditions. We don't know what's going to happen in the future with these types of properties, so we have to be very careful and cautious when valuing them, when looking at appraisals, when reviewing um, sales and agreements. So it's just a tricky asset class. And there's various bullet points there, sort of summarizing where we think the most difficult parts of valuing data center lie. Um, and that is pretty much it.
Yeah, I think intellectually it raises some fun
Fun,
questions that we can spend some time mining and figuring out how it applies to the questions that we need to answer in our field.
So with that, I'm gonna try to figure out how to unmute. Oh, okay,
Everybody
thank you.
should be able to unmute themselves now.
And let me make this bigger so I can potentially see people. So does anybody have
Questions or
questions?
comments?
Okay, I see something in the chat, but you can either throw it in the chat or raise your hand or just blurt it out. Adrian, have you gotten any direction from the Department of Revenue on valuing these? She might not be there. I see her.
No, because there's nothing statutory
Okay.
in state law that drives a specific valuation method for this. We would defer to the local assessors to use the appropriate approach to value. I agree with what you're saying that the cost approach probably makes the most sense. There's not a lot of these being bought and sold on the open market, so sales comparison isn't necessarily a good valuation method, at least right now. And I agree with you on the income approach being pretty difficult to get what you need. So the few questions I have had, I have leaned into cost approach on these as well.
And that brings up a good point because I called on you because I had reached out to you for some direction because I had a client that was considering a development in a county outside of Cook. And ultimately, I think outside, particularly outside of Cook, we'll just leave Cook aside for a moment. Probably the best bet is a data center developer talking to the local assessor, the supervisor, potentially getting some advice from the Department of Revenue and working out a multi-year agreement about how that asset is going to be valued. Again, circling it back to certainty and predictability and uniformity, at least within a county. So that is what I am seeing from the particular client that had reached out to me, who does not have assets in Cook County, wanting to come up with an agreement before they dig ground or even actually before they even purchase the land. Christina Lynch, I have heard Illinois is ideal for data centers because of its superior energy grid.
I don't know that we've heard that particular concern. I think the disaster resistance of Illinois is a draw. And Governor Pritzker has definitely portrayed Illinois as a welcome state for data centers. I also know that there's a bit of a push-pull. Like there's some jurisdictions that are taxing a data center or valuing a data center is very high. And it depends on a number of factors. That could very well be one of them.
Yeah, I think there's certain areas that were previously industrial parks or that were previously developing things that were in need of a lot of energy. So there is some built-in energy in certain pockets. Haven't heard it as a state as a whole.
I think the other concern there is also BIPA.
Yeah, BIPA has been the thing that they've been talking about mostly lately.
That's the hot topic that we've been hearing about.
We only hear the bad news, Christina. Tamarcus says regarding depreciation, would it be the building, real estate, or the server's IT equipment that depreciates the 70 to 90% in a few years you referred to?
So it can be both, honestly. Like that's an example of some of this stuff just becomes obsolete. Even the HVAC system on something like this can become obsolete. For some operators, they're finding raised floors to be more obsolete than they had been in the past. They're less desirable. because of changes in technology. I think we're also seeing cooling systems are changing quite a lot. And then the rack volume that we've talked about, maybe you don't need the same square footage
Right.
that you might have before. So
That's
there is,
changing fast. We don't even know where that's going to go. And we're just hearing there are already super adequacies in the size. Like,
Yeah,
not
so-
super adequacy. Obsolescence already in the size.
yeah, so there's, I think it's important to remember that while it is the technology that's driving this depreciation, that has ramifications falling back on the real estate itself as well.
Absolutely. And the second question you had was about pending appeals. I believe there are, but they are in the very, very early stages. None of them are quite ripe for hearing. I believe, because these are new. Some of the older ones we've settled, but those were not new data centers. I had one that was an older repurposed industrial building into a data center.
Yeah,
It was
there's-
much easier to resolve.
That's a big difference in the market here is those retrofitted industrial or even commercial residential properties into data centers versus something that's purpose-built. So the market is there's a difference, a drastic difference there.
And obviously, we're keeping our eyes out for not only case law legislation, anything like that on data centers, but similar properties that we discussed in the analogies section.
If you guys hear of
Right.
any, let us know.
Any other questions? And feel free to unmute yourself too if you'd rather, talk instead of using the chat.
Yeah, you're straining my eyes with this chat, but
We had to put the screen away so both of us could be in the view, and now it's tough to read.
I think it worked well having you guys on the same
Yeah.
video, though. I think it had helped feel like, you were presenting together as opposed to like presenting from like two different locations.
I feel like we do better when we can feed off of each other's energy.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
Julie, have you heard anything about the battery energy storage legislation? I'm just calling on people now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I
Yes.
can.
So I actually attended the Illinois Renewable Energy Conference. I think it was last week in Normal, and they surveyed every presenter that talked, and we got kind of anywhere from 50 to 70% confidence rating that the energy omnibus bill may pass right now during veto session, but depending on who you talk to, it was up in the air. The last I checked our language, it was still the same from earlier this year. So,
Okay, well, we're keeping our eyes on it too.
okay.
Fingers crossed.
Let's see what comes down.
I guess I don't really have a question, and maybe it's more of a comment or thought. You talked about the M&E and considering it as personal property, and I guess I'm just struggling with that a little bit because, this obviously, as you mentioned, that this data centers are a very specific, unique property type, and in almost all cases, I imagine I don't know every single data center that's out there, but I think that what tenants are coming in and leasing energy or power that they can use to generate what they need to generate. And I just don't know how any tenant would come in and lease space from a building that doesn't have that machinery and equipment that's in it and that's part of the real estate, which to me would be different than repurposing the entire building for a completely different use. I don't know. So those are just my thoughts on it. And it would be great to have some case law. I suppose that's more my comment, but that's why I struggle with it.
Well, and I think that we're not saying it's black and white. All the machinery and equipment is taxable, or all of the machinery and equipment is not taxable. There's a gray area here. There are certain
That's
clients
fair.
that there's clients that come into data centers with their own machinery and equipment in some instances, but there might be the power that they've got that they're getting, but they're coming in with their own racks, they're coming in with their own servers, they're coming in with their, I don't know enough about it to know all the terminology, but they're coming in with their own M&E, and there also is some built-in M&E. There's both.
Right. Okay. So that makes sense. So then you're saying maybe people are coming in and part of the lease agreement is that they're bringing in their own equipment.
We've
Yeah.
seen those.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
okay.
those are the powered shell leases, which
Mhm.
are the ones that are, at least from where we're sitting, the cleanest most easily used for our purposes are those powered shell leases.
Okay,
I feel
that's
like
helpful.
they're the
That
most
makes
illustrative.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no easy answer.
No.
I mean, it's complicated.
That's fair.
It's changing quickly. But just be cautious about putting it all on as taxable. That would be, I don't think, a fair way to value these at all.
Yeah, there's a middle ground. I think we're probably going to be standing not right next to each other in that middle ground, but probably closer than we think, right?
We're just gonna reach across and find the
Yeah.
agreement.
Appreciate you both. Thanks.
I want to thank Ellen and Jennifer for spending the hour with us here and providing us with all of this information about data centers. I knew nothing about data centers or even like what they were composed of. So I learned a lot during this session too, and I hope you did as well. With that said, thank you all so much for attending. Again, thank you, Ellen and Jennifer, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.